right, so welcome to church history. Let's get started with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this evening. I thank you for carrying each one safely here tonight. Lord, I ask you to be with those who could not be with us tonight for whatever reason. Lord, I ask you that you would be with them and hold them close, Lord, and give them a blessed evening. Lord, I ask that you be with each one here. Lord, I thank you so much for those who are continuing to show up, Lord, who are willing to put the work in, Lord, and who are just trying. I pray that you will be with each one. I pray that you will open doors and that you will make connections. And Lord, that you will just continue to teach us all about who you are and the history of your church. And we just thank you and we love you. And we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so I want to start off. So last week we sort of ended with the fall of Jerusalem, 70 AD, right? Just for a moment, I want to back up to 48 AD, just to this one event. It's really important. In 48 AD, okay, so Paul had been doing his missionary journeys. He had been going, if you follow your map or look at your map, he was starting out in Antioch or in Jerusalem, and he was moving up the coast and going into Asia Minor, and actually he went to Cyprus. Actually, his first journey he went to Cyprus. But anyway, he was in this area, and he was planting churches all along Asia Minor, where Smyrna and Ephesus and in that area of Bithynia, he was planting all these churches. Well, as he was moving along, I think I mentioned this last week, as he was moving along, he would find people, he would speak the truth, he would plant a church, and then he would move on. And following behind him would be this group of Judaizers. And they would come along and they'd say, oh, it's really great that you believe in Jesus, that's fine, but you also have to be circumcised and you have to follow the law. Like you have to have those two things, and then Jesus is fine to add to that, right? And so they were coming along behind him and kind of just putting some doubts into the churches as he was planning them. And some of the letters that you see produced in the New Testament are in answer to some of those doubts. Thessalonians is one of those. Anyway, we won't get into that. So the question was, from these churches collectively, they were saying, okay, is Christ enough? Is belief in Jesus as the Messiah, is that enough for salvation, or is it Jesus plus the law and circumcision? That's the question. Well, James, the brother of Jesus, called this council, okay, because he was the pastor in Jerusalem at this time in 48. I was going to say 3. In 48 AD, he was the pastor. He called a pastor's conference basically and said, all right, we got to get this figured out. So Paul and Simon and all these people, they trekked down to Jerusalem, and they have this big, huge council, and you can read all about it in Acts 15. Bottom line is, at the end of the council, what was determined was that faith in Jesus is all that's needed. The law and the circumcision are not needed for salvation. That was basically the bottom line that came out of the Jerusalem Council. So Paul takes this letter and runs with it and starts circulating this decree, and starts circulating it. Okay, so this. And whenever I tell this, I really want everyone to keep in mind that sometimes, even without even meaning to, whenever we tell stories, just as people, we tell stories and we're like, okay, everybody loves Paul. I mean, if you're in this room, you probably love Paul and you admire the work that God did through him, right? And he's just trying to do God's work, and then here come these people, and they're kind of blowing things up and messing it up. But remember, that is sort of a Christian perspective looking at something. Or someone who agrees with Paul already, looking at this situation. But if you look at it from the perspective of being a Jew, being Jewish, they are just as much trying to keep people from erring. They're following around and saying, and they're not saying it just to mess Paul up. I mean, but for whatever reason, the way that we think and the way that we tell stories and the way we interpret, because of our own belief system, we look at that story and we're like, the Judaizers, whatever. But even Saul, whenever he was going after Christians before his famous walk on the road to Damascus, he was doing what he felt was in his heart and soul absolutely the right thing for God. He was not going after people just for the heck of it and just for the fun of it. And he certainly was not consenting to deaths such as Stephen's lightly or easily. He truly believed, just as these Judaizers believed, that they were saving people from a grave error. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Many times it's not nearly the victimization that it seems like whenever we tell these stories. I mean, each side, sometimes it is a victimization. We'll see some of that in history, but it's not always on the side of the not Christian. Sometimes it's the Christian victimizing. So you just keep in mind that as these things are happening, the people who are doing these things and saying these things, they're trying to correct what they feel is a big problem. So just keep it in mind as we keep going. So with this in mind, we've had a conflict from the beginning. The Jews did not recognize Christianity as a branch of their own religion. Christians were trying to make it that way because they see it as the continuation of the promises that were given in the Old Testament. And there's just this conflict is starting to happen. Remember that the Roman government at this time was ignoring the Christians basically because they saw them as members of the Jewish religion, right, or a sect or branch off of Judaism. So right now things are fairly okay in places, in parts, because people get fired up. So regardless of what the law is, sometimes persecution happens, right? So in your reading this week, one of the things that was talked about within the first couple of pages is this term Catholic. Well, I should do it this way. Let's do it this way to make a distinction. This term Catholic. The book talks about, it's believed that Ignatius, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit, he's the first person to have used this term in this way. This term, when it was originally coined, so to speak, meant universal. It was meant as a unifying term. If you were a Christian in Antioch, or if you were a Christian in Ephesus, or a Christian in Jerusalem, we were all of the same church, of the same belief. Christ is the center of it. We are a universal thought, a universal theology. So it was becoming known as Catholic Christianity. Not to be confused with, we're not going to get into this right now, we'll get into it as it comes through history, as opposed to Roman Catholic Christianity. That is actually a separate branch, and that happens after Protestantism comes up and officially forms itself. Okay? So for now, this has nothing to do with Roman Catholic. This is just simply the idea that if you're a Christian, no matter where you are, what language you speak, where you live, whatever, you are in unity with the other Christians in the world. Okay? So it was a conviction that was held by all Christian churches at this time. And one of the things that came with being a universal Catholic Christian was this idea of orthodox. All Christians at this time were considered orthodox. This term simply means good theology. Theology is basically the study of God. So, Catholic Christianity was an orthodox religion, which means that it was a good theology. What came out of it was correct, was a true theology. This is just a definition, okay? As opposed to heresy, which would be bad theology, okay? All right, so after Jerusalem fell, this is where this little map is going to come into play. After Jerusalem fell, the book sort of went through this, but I'm making an assumption for you, which may not be true. as I've read this book, and I read it every time I teach, I read the chapters with you so that I know what's happening. Every time I read chapters like, especially chapter 3, where they're talking about how Christianity spread, it's very difficult for me to understand what they're really talking about because I don't know the geography, and I don't understand how it spreads to all these places. And sometimes the name that it was called at this time is now a different name today, and all these things like this, right? So you don't have to memorize this. That's not what this is for. This is just to help you as maybe if you decide to reread the chapter to study for the test, you may or may not, but that's up to you. But if you have this map in front of you, whenever you're reading it, it makes so much more sense. So I'm just making an assumption that worked for me that may work for you. So Christianity started off in Antioch of Syria. So that is, so here's the Mediterranean Sea, and here is Antioch of Syria. If everybody can find that, that's our starting point. Okay? So Jerusalem falls. The center of Christianity moves to Antioch, and the book mentions this little town called Edessa. It's sort of north, a teeny bit north, and a little bit west. I don't think it's on this map because it just won't fit. It's teeny, tiny, little bit north, little bit west of Antioch, and it's believed that they had a very strong communication with Antioch, and that that Christianity spread to India from that area. No one is absolutely sure about that, but that's what the book was talking about with the Thomas Christians. That Edessa is really, really close to, like, if you're down the coastline and here's Antioch, it may not be right on the coast, sorry. Here's Antioch, Edessa would be like right there. It's super close, okay? After it moved north, it then moved west, okay? And covered some areas, and as the New Testament will confirm, it went off into Ephesus and Corinth, and then just above, I have it written in, I don't know if you can read my writing, it's not very small, it's not very big, but so where it says Asia Minor, if you look north, there's Byzantium. In between that, there is kind of a slanted word called Bithynia. That is a region. It's not a city, it's a region, and it just covers this little area. Bithynia is interesting and has some importance because there was a man named Pliny. His name was Pliny the Younger. His relative, Pliny the Elder, was good friends with the emperor at the time, Emperor Trajan. Okay? So basically, Pliny the Younger got this job in Bithynia, through networking. It's who you know, right? So he's got this job, and the economics and all this stuff are all messed up whenever he goes into the region. They send him in there to kind of clean things up. Well, Christianity spread into Bithynia, and it's really interesting because Pliny the Younger wrote a couple of letters to Trajan asking him for counsel, like what to do with these Christians. So basically, the Christians were being noticed. Some of the local commerce, like pagan commerce, like selling of idols and things like that, some of that started going down a little bit when Christianity hit. And that people took notice of. The people who dealt in those things were losing money. The government, therefore, was losing money. The local government, he was there to try to clean that up, whatever. So they were definitely noticed. Well, it's interesting because he says, this is what, according to this website, it's all of these websites said basically the same thing, but this is the sum, this is what they call the sum of the guilt of the error of the Christians. They had been accustomed to come together on a fixed day before daylight and to sing responsively a song to Christ as God. They bound themselves with an oath not to commit some crime, but on the contrary, that they would not commit theft or robbery or adultery, that they would not break faith nor refuse to return a deposit when asked for it. When they had done these things, their custom was to separate and to assemble again to partake of a meal, common yet harmless, but is not a characteristic of a nefarious superstition. So, because Christianity was considered a superstition at the time. So, basically, that was the charge. They gathered, they oathed to be good to one another and be good to the community at large. And, but what this doesn't say, they did not participate in certain things. This is empire-wide. One of the reasons that the Christians were noticed was not only for what they did, but for what they didn't do. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit more later. But I just wanted you to know, Pliny was in a pickle. Pliny was in a pickle because he basically had this issue. People were bringing Christians to him saying, do something about these people. They're bugging us. We don't like them. They're breaking our sales, whatever. And he's like, well, they're not really doing anything wrong. But, so are you a Christian? Yes, I am. Well, I'm going to torture you if you tell me you're a Christian. Are you still a Christian? Yes, I am. Well, I'm going to punish you. So they just kept coming back and saying, I don't care what you say. This is why he was writing these letters back to the emperor. And he actually did end up killing a few of the Christians because they would not renounce their faith. Well, the emperor wrote back and said, you've done well. You've basically got a job down there. Clean up the economy, clean up the area. So don't go out looking for Christians to kill. Don't start a big hullabaloo over the whole thing. But if they're brought to you and they're unrepentant and this and that, then you're fine to kill them. It's fine. You just do what you want. Just don't go after them. Yes.
And that they don't pledge allegiance.
That's right. That was the next thing. That's the next thing that Pliny did. No, that's fine. That's the next thing he did is he had a statue brought in, or maybe he even had it made there, but I think he had it brought in, and that became the test. Are you a Christian? Yes, I am. All right, well, I'm going to, if you were a Gentile, what he would say is, I'm going to kill you now. You're going to be executed if you don't renounce and pinch incense or pay homage to the statue. Many of them renounced because maybe they really weren't Christians apparently, but many did not, and many died. And I don't mean many on a scale of like what we will talk about. It's a very small community, so many could be 10. It's a very small community. But and if you were a Roman citizen, then you were threatened to be shipped off to Rome and taken care of in Rome. That's just what you did. If as a Roman citizen, you sent them off to Rome, shipped them off, and let Rome take care of it. So anyway, the reason this is important, the reason we're spending any time at all on it is because this was the first time the Roman government, now granted it's one little teeny tiny city and one little emperor or little governor, okay, in Pliny. So this is certainly not empire-wide, but it is the first time that it's recorded that people died because they claimed Christianity by the government. Because remember, before this, the government just sort of washed over them. But now they're being seen on some small scale as separate. And that's important. So that's why we talk about Bithynia. All right, so as the church keeps going east, it crosses through a couple of bodies of water and ends up in Rome. And after it ends up in Rome, it ends up going north into Gaul. Gaul is modern-day France, by the way, for those of you that are not sure about that. That is modern-day France. The Rhine River that's right there, that is going to come into importance later on after we have gotten into Protestantism pretty heavily. Something significant happens along the Rhine River, but we'll talk about it when we get there. It spreads on into Gaul, a little bit south into Spain, and all the way up into Great Britain. Okay, so Christianity just sort of comes and spreads all through that area. It also spreads south down into Carthage. Carthage is the birthplace of the man Tertullian. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. He's considered one of the most brilliant men of antiquity. He is the person who coined the term Trinity. He's the first person to have put that together and coined a term for it. That's all we'll say about him right now. But he was also the father of Latin theology. Your book talks about that. I think your book gives him that title at this point. So Tertullian is the father of Latin theology, which would be a fantastic bonus question.
Hint.
Could be. I haven't written the test, so I don't know. I mean, if I don't remember, then I guess it's an awful question. But anyway, I'm just saying that's a good question. Anyway, all right. Went down into Carthage, and then it continued to move east. I've noted right next to Alexandria, the city of Cyrene. The only reason I noted that is just because for those of you that have read the New Testament or have heard stories, Simon the Cyrene carried the cross. This is the area, just so you know where Cyrene is. It actually is just trivia. And then also continued to move all the way over into Egypt, into Alexandria. So you can see how Christianity started and then just basically went around the entire Roman Empire, okay? So hopefully the map helps you. Like if you read through your book with the map, it just makes more sense, and it may help you to, if you can see the map, then sometimes you can remember, where you're at a little bit easier. So we will talk about Alexandria a little bit later. All right, so now let's get into what the learning part, that was just sort of the fun, kind of trying to make the book more exciting, a history book more exciting. All right, so Christianity spread, we just talked about that. Your book talks about that. There are 5 major reasons that's an E, for the spread of Christianity. And if I spell something wrong, you can tell me because I'm not my forte. So I'll just erase it and move on. All right. So the very first reason, and so many times whenever you see lists like this, they'll say there's 4 major reasons. We're going to say 5, because the first major reason is God himself. And it is because of what we talked about with our quiz today. God will be in control, and he is going to guide this world in the direction he wants it to go. His conclusion, his plan, his way, his time. So God is the reason that Christianity spread. But that's sort of notwithstanding. It's kind of cheating whenever you're in a Christian, a Christian setting, taking a church history class, and why did it spread? God. That's pretty obvious. So let's move on to the ones that may not be quite so obvious. The second is, and I think I heard somebody say this, that's right, burning conviction. The burning conviction in the hearts of believers. This dates all the way back to the apostles remember we talked last week when we said after Christ was crucified and he died, they were just in despair. And they sort of, not scattered as in, out of the country, but, just went their separate ways in the city, and they were all bummed out. But then after he resurrected, burning conviction. And there was no way anyone was going to talk them out of who Christ is and why he was here and what he did while he was here. So burning conviction. That burning conviction was spread. Well, it's obviously, if you can spread that burning conviction, you've got Christianity going like gangbusters, right? All right, 3, this is sort of the head's side of the coin. This is the tail side of the coin, okay? Needy hearts of the unbelievers. Most were polytheistic, had many gods that they paid one homage or another to. Many had rituals that were based in fear or other strong emotions, and things just don't always work out the way you think they're going to work out, or they should work out, or whatever. And so there's always a need in an unbeliever's heart to find something to fill them, and Christianity was it for a lot of people. Number 4, this is very scriptural. Glad I didn't spell that. That would have been spelled wrong. I said, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, the agape love Christians had for one another. It was infectious. Just like we talked about with Bithynia, these were people who, if, let's just say there's a transaction. A Christian comes to me as an unbeliever and says, I need a loan for $10. Can you give me $10? And the guy says, and I say, sure. You can have $10. When are you going to pay me back? And the Christian says, well, when do you want to be paid back? And I say, 2 weeks when you get paid. You can pay me back in 2 weeks. And then the Christian says, okay, I'll do it. So I give him $10, runs on his way. Well, then something happens and I need gas in my car. And I'm like, I got to go get my $10 back. But it hasn't been 2 weeks. So then I run up to the Christian and I say, I'm sorry, I need that money back. And the Christian, what they say, instead of, I've got a week and a half, they say, here it is. And they give them all they have to pay their debt right then and there as soon as it's asked for. Unheard of. Like, totally that's just an example, but just behaving in a way that was very different from the culture around them. So this agape love that Christians had for one another, that they extended outside of the family. Whenever unbelievers came into a Christian circle and saw the way that they treated each other, it was even more amazing. Very, very noticeable. And finally, this is very counterintuitive until you are done with this class. After this class, this won't be counterintuitive anymore. The fifth reason is persecution. In general, you'll find that throughout the history of the Christian church, I think maybe I said this last week, whenever there is persecution coming into the church gets strong and it explodes. Lots of people they may be hiding it, but people join Christianity, they join the faith, and they become believers. And they are, they have a very real and solid conviction about who Jesus is because it's in the midst of persecution. You don't join a movement that is being slaughtered unless you believe in what the movement is about, right? But as the Christian church becomes complacent, no persecution, very easy, then it becomes a term that we use called watered down, where you may or may not really believe that Jesus is Lord. I mean, we can talk about it, we can say it, but maybe not. And then it just kind of, the theology starts getting a little weird if you're not careful. So these are the 5 reasons that Christianity spread. And I think that I think I mentioned this last time. That group of people, so there were 4 groups of people that we talked about even prior to the Christian church being officially forming. You had the Hebrew-speaking Jews, the Greek-speaking Jews, the proselytes, and the God-fearers, right? So those proselytes and those God-fearers loved Judaism. The proselytes went gangbusters and agreed to be circumcised and actually converted. But those God-fearers didn't, for whatever reason. Most of the time what you read about, their reason is that they found it horrific to damage or alter your body that way. They just found it very repulsive. But anyway, for whatever reason, they didn't go as far as circumcision, so they stayed out of Judaism. Well, when Christianity started to spread, these God-fearers, and the proselytes too, but these God-fearers, they knew the scriptures. They knew the Old Testament because they loved Judaism. They studied as often as they could. As often as the Jews would talk to them and teach them and whatever, they were there and they were just soaking it in. Then here comes Christianity and these people who have all of these first few characteristics. They already know the prophecies of the coming Messiah, and then here comes Christianity saying, well, look, they're all fulfilled. And those God-fearers, Christians, they were just coming to Christ in droves. This was the majority of converts throughout the empire were God-fearers. It was a big chunk of them. So, let's talk a little bit. Does everybody have this? All right. So let's talk a little bit about martyrdom. This part of the talk, so everything we've talked about up to this point, we're still early in the 2nd century. Okay, we're still in the hundreds or so, somewhere in the hundreds. What we're going to talk about now is going to branch out a little bit further, but not beyond what you read, but just we're going to keep going into the future as we talk about this. Okay. Let me give you a statistic. This was last year's statistic. I didn't look it up for this year, but this is what I found last year. It was estimated by the end of the 3rd century, so that's by 299, right? The end of the 3rd century. It was estimated that 10% of the Roman Empire was Christian. And we're talking genuine Christians who are ready to go to their death to continue to claim Jesus as the Messiah. Now, depending on what source you look at, which is why I kind of wish I would have looked this up again to see if there was something more exact. I looked up several sources last year. Anywhere from there, in the Roman Empire as a total, the population was anywhere between 60 million and 100 million. Now, I realize that's a huge gap, but I don't know which it is. It's just the statistics that I found in different sources. So anywhere between 60 million and 100 million total in the Roman Empire. So that means that by the end of the 3rd century, anywhere from 6 to 10 million people were Christians. That's a lot of people for the Roman Empire. So just a statistic. All right. So the first 300 years of the history of the church are sometimes known as the Age of Martyrs. When I give you Fox's Book of Martyrs, it's largely covering this span of time, but not exclusively. The word martyr means witness. So, if you are willing to go to your death rather than deny Christ, you are witnessing for him, witnessing who he is, what he's done, what his death means, and you are willing to go as a witness to your death. And so that's where the term martyr, or how the term martyr is used. It's used very differently today. The term martyr is used secularly as well, because it just means witness. It doesn't necessarily mean witness for Christ, it just means witness. All right, let's talk a little bit about why Christians were persecuted. All right. So we talked about this a little bit. This, it's mainly, it's funny, it's for what they did and what they didn't do. Anyway, so the Roman Empire at this time was saturated with paganism. Lots and lots of different gods, lots of rituals, lots of this and that and the other, right? It was just all over the empire. So, as part of the culture, there would be, for example, a banquet, with that banquet being including a sacrifice to this god. In the schools, the children were taught about the different gods that make up all of this polytheistic religion, all of this pagan religion. Maybe even the school plays, they probably didn't have those then, but even things that were happening where the children were participating very likely revolved around learning or worshiping or learning how to worship these different gods. Lots and lots and lots of idolatry. So Christians, because they did not want to participate in any sort of worship or sacrifice or eating of a sacrifice for any sort of idol. They didn't want their children, as much as they could help it, to be influenced by this. So what they were doing was they would get these dinner parties that were, citywide, where different people would be having dinner parties, but it was all for this one purpose, for some god, some worshiping some god. They wouldn't go they'd get these invitations, but they wouldn't go. the school would invite them to come in and do something. I'm using modern terms. The school would invite them to come in and let their kids participate in the winter play. They wouldn't let their kids participate. They just stopped being part of the pagan portion of the culture. Now, they were still in society. They were still buying and selling and working and, being members of society. But for the strictly pagan parts of it, they stopped. And it was considered really rude. Like at first, it was an offense. And then as it carried on, it became an irritation. And it became gosh, I really can't stand these people. Like they think they're so this and that and the other, all of these things start happening, resentment, right? So the 4 main reasons why Christians were persecuted during this time frame, I'm going to write them and then we'll talk about them briefly. The first one, different lifestyles, which we kind of touched on. The second one, slanderous rumors, which again, last week I think, I can't speak and write at the same time, sorry. We talked a little bit about this group before too, but we'll talk about it officially tonight. Thirdly, they were accused as atheists. And fourth, they refused emperor worship. All right. So, these different lifestyles. It's very much the same as like what I've already talked about with, people refusing to go to dinner parties, refusing to be part of celebrations or parades or whatever that's going on in honor of these different gods. The Christians set themselves apart from society if what was happening had anything to do with paganism. And this idea of separation, we've talked about it in services many times, this word holy meaning separate or different, like a holy day was a different day or a separate day. And today we've just sort of, Englishized it and we call it a holiday, but the original root was holy day. And it didn't it did mean something to the pagans. It was worshiping a god or celebrating the return from worshiping a god or whatever. But in today's culture, a holiday is a little bit different than that. But this separation, it was almost inadvertent. They just didn't want to participate. They were just backing out. And they weren't making huge, it wasn't a big deal. They weren't, I'm not going to, some people probably did because let's face it, some people are, big personalities. But in general, the Christians were just saying, I'm going to stay home. And they just wouldn't participate. But it was noticed, it was considered rude, and then it became an irritation. The slanderous rumors, we talked a little bit about one of these last 2 weeks, especially with the services. So when communion would come around, many times, so people were allowed in some respect to come into the services without being Christian. But at the time that the communion was passed out, people were asked to leave. They were separated out so that they wouldn't take part in something they shouldn't, right? And so this separation, along with outside observers finding out about these love feasts, like people were not invited to the agape feasts because they were completely Christian. And so this, it's not separation, what am I trying to say? They were excluded, this exclusion. So the Christians separated themselves from paganism, but then they excluded paganism, so to speak, from their services, right? Well, being excluded, that's a recipe for rumors. Well, why won't they let us in? What are they doing that we can't be a part of? What's happening in there? So the things come up. And then you call it an agape feast, a love feast. And then it really just goes out of control and people are freaking out, and even in the scriptures it talks about greeting each other with a holy kiss and all this stuff, and just, whatever. Things just got crazy. So these slanderous rumors were on some level a reaction to being excluded. They didn't know what was happening, and that still happens today when you don't know what's happening, and you're kind of like, you're not going to admit it, but I'm a little offended that I wasn't invited in here, or whatever. Well, they're probably blah, blah, blahing anyway. I don't want to be a part of that. It's just human nature, not giving you an excuse for it, but it's just what it is. We are people now just as they were people then. So those slanderous rumors just went all over the place. The rumors of cannibalism were pretty devastating to the Christians. That was, even in a pagan culture, that was a big no-no. They were accused as atheists. We talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, too. Outsiders would be invited into the service, like I said, non-believers would be invited into the service, and they would witness people worshiping on their knees or raising their hands or in whatever style they were worshiping. Nothing. There was no statue, there was no altar, there was no burning of anything, there was no incense, nothing. It was just singing, praising, reading scripture. Well, it wasn't scripture at the time, reading letters, reading Old Testament letters, things like that, but to absolutely nothing and no one, and to a highly idolatrous community, a polytheistic community that had statues and little statues, big statues, whatever, for everything. They were like, wow, they are crazy. Like, they really thought that the Christians were kind of, because they were basically worshiping nothing. So they were accused as atheists. And this was also repulsive to the community. In this culture, being an atheist is not repulsive. Like, people are not aghast at the idea. In this culture, they were. Like, if you weren't worshiping God, something is wrong with you. Like, something is really wrong with you. It was not tolerated. And this refusing emperor worship, somebody, I think maybe you last week asked me about the emperor worship. Not every emperor in the empire required worship. And not every emperor in the empire throughout these years claimed deity. But what ended up happening many times is, so Rome was strong. And one of the reasons, and it was also very united. In general, if you were a Roman citizen, you were united with the rest of Rome. The reason is because Rome would come into a new place, they would take over, and they would institute this Pax Romana, this enforced peace. But they didn't just enforce it by saying, we're going to hurt you if you don't behave. They actually got rid of everything. They got rid of the thieves. They got rid of the murder. They got rid of the crime. They fixed the roads. They built roads.
Today.
I know. Fair enough. I know. And so when they came into an area, they didn't just take it over and then ignore it. They took it over, cleaned it up, fixed it up, got it to where people could go from one place to another without living in fear of being robbed. That's part of what set up Jesus being able to walk around, and people knew everybody's languages. Like, it was all one big community. It was amazing. And so this Pax Romana was an important feature of Rome's government and their society. Well, so in general, because of the Pax Romana and this sort of love of nation sort of thing, there was the spirit of Rome that began to show itself. The spirit of Rome is great. The spirit of Rome is powerful. It was just kind of an idea, right? A way to describe the government or the empire. Well, as time progressed, sometimes the spirit of Rome started to take on its own life. Like, it became an actual living being in the minds of people. The spirit lives, right? And then, much like Egypt, the spirit lives in the emperor of the time. The spirit is exuded and enforced by the emperor of the time. And so then that's when lines started getting crossed. Because as an emperor, if you actually believe you have the spirit of Rome in some instance, and you believe that you do have a lot of power, I mean, you can do whatever you want, basically, then it becomes, I am a god, you will do what I say, and you will worship me. Again, not all emperors did that, but the emperors that required it, the Christians would not call them Lord. What they would have to do is pinch incense and proclaim that Caesar is Lord. And in doing so, if they did it, they got this piece of paper called I'm going to spell it wrong. Oh, see, I've already spelled it wrong. Should have looked first. All right. Libellus. Called a libellus. This was basically a certificate given by a Roman official to somebody, and it is your proof that you pinched the incense and said Caesar is Lord. Okay? Now, one thing to really understand, sometimes the emperor wanted this because they felt like they were a god. Sometimes the emperor wanted this and had no intention of claiming deity at all, but they still required it. Why? So, Rome was built based on conquering small areas of land, fixing it up, cleaning it up, and basically governing it, right? Their whole government plan was based around unity. So, the emperor is the center of that nation or that empire. And so, as a citizen of Rome, loyalty was absolutely essential. A person who was not loyal to Rome was not tolerated. They were out, right? So, this was more of a political move than it was a religious move. This pinching the incense and emperor worship. Now, granted, sometimes people get crazy. I am God. But in general, this emperor worship was not about religion. It was about unification of government. It was about loyalty to the empire. So, as a Christian, you're going into this as saying, I love Jesus. Jesus is Lord. I cannot pinch the incense and say Caesar is Lord because it's a quote-unquote religious issue. The government hears that, and they're like, oh my gosh, we have treason. We have a rebel. We have someone who's going to rise up and try to cause problems in the empire. That's what they saw. They're out. So while largely we see this as a religious issue, and it is. It's not that it's not a religious issue, but just remember that the two sides are seeing something different. And then after a while, it was just Christianity. Oh, those Christians are such a problem. They won't pinch the incense. We have to kill them, and we have to do this. They're such a problem, right? But just remember, when it started, it was really political and not so much. It had nothing to do with Jesus. Like, Rome was not anti-Jesus. Like, Rome didn't care about Jesus. As far as Rome was concerned, Jesus was just another in a long line of gods. So basically, you could do this, pinch the incense, and get your libellus. You could go off and worship whoever you wanted after that. I mean, Rome didn't care who you worshiped, as long as you showed loyalty to Rome in the form of emperor worship. Does that make sense? All right. That is all we have time for. Man, I didn't get to any martyrs. We'll do martyrs next time.